Thank you for coming to our second session in this year of mercy. Well, last month we were talking about Pope Francis and mercy and his experience. Remember, we said that he told us that he wanted us to make alive the experience of God's mercy. And that's very important. The experience of God's mercy, not the theology, not the concept or the idea of mercy, the experience of mercy. Then it is in our lives and not just in our heads. And so that's what we're trying to do in both last month's session, trying to get into our experience of God's mercy. And that's what we want to continue to do in today's session, the experience of God's mercy. And you will recall that for Pope Francis, the experience of God's mercy came to him. We had these pictures up here. Came to him when he was 17 and was on his way with some friends to a party, and they passed a church. And he left the friends and went into the church because something was tugging at him, needing confession. And so he went in and he experienced God's mercy for the first time. He talks about how God was waiting for him there. And through that priest welcoming him like God welcoming the prodigal son, he knew, not in his head, but in his guts, the mercy, the forgiveness of God. And that changed him forever. And that is what he wishes for the whole church during this year of mercy. Don't just talk about mercy or how beautiful the idea is. Experience it. Where have you experienced it? Well, then fan into flame the results of that experience and live from that experience. Bring to others what you have experienced. That's Pope Francis, his experience of God's mercy. It came through his recognition that he is a sinner in need of God's mercy. And that is a theme that goes through everything that he talks and writes about. In fact, the very first words that he said to the cardinals when he was elected, they have to go to the one that they have chosen to see if he will accept it. And he said, these are his first words, "I am a great sinner, but I trust in God's mercy and patience, and so I accept." That awareness of his need for mercy, which makes him a brother to everyone else. He is not better than other people. He is one of them. And that's what we pick up, is it not, when we are with him or see him. I am a great sinner. Today we get into Father Solanus and mercy. And it is good that we do this because Father Solanus' experience of mercy was from a different point of view. And that it helps us to see how rich the whole reality of mercy is. Pope Francis's experience is authentic, and many of us, maybe most of us, can relate to that, need to relate to that. Father Solanus' experience is from a different point of view. And what I would like to say at the very beginning is that I lived with Father Solanus. And so that makes who he is, who he was, especially significant to me. You see, I came to our Capuchin order in the summer of 1956, and it was here at St. Bonaventure's that we had our novitiate. And that Father Solanus was stationed here, and that was, in fact, his last year alive. He died on July 31st, 1957. So my first year in the order was with him in his last year in the order. And I have many wonderful memories of Father Solanus, and I will share some of them, but I would just like to tell you one of the stories as we begin, and that is on Christmas night, not Christmas Eve, Christmas night, which was his last Christmas alive. I was, after supper, I was going to go down with with my fellow novices to have Christmas recreation. And so I went into our little chapel here to have a visit with Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. And you know how there are two doors between the small chapel, which is our chapel, and then the big chapel out here. Well, all the lights were out in the big chapel, and I heard a squeaky noise coming from the big chapel, and I knew exactly what it was. But I had to open the door to see it. And there, on Christmas night, all by himself, and I was the only one that even knew it, was Father Solanus up in the choir loft, playing his violin, Christmas carols, to the Christ child in the crib. That was Father Solanus. Well, what I would like to talk about is how he came to his experience of God's mercy. Do you know, if you go out to his tomb, you will see carved around the edges of his tomb the top part of that quotation. Blessed be God in all his designs. But as I have gotten more and more into Father Solanus, I have discovered, and it's kind of unfortunate, that that's only one half of what Father Solanus said. He did say Blessed be God in all his designs. And then he added, and in his mercy, which is above all his works. That's what I want to talk about. Where does this come from? These are not words, simple words or concepts. They are lived reality and experience. And you know that Father Solanus was not a theologian. In fact, and we'll talk about that, it was a very iffy proposition for him to even be ordained. But he caught, just as Pope Francis has caught, that the essence, the heart of Jesus and the heart of the gospel is exactly this: his mercy, which is above all his works. That is the heart of our faith. The reason to have hope is because of his mercy. And that is rooted in Solanus's journey. You see, this is the second aspect of mercy. Pope Francis, as I said, it concentrates on the mercy of God that wants to always forgive us, welcome us, accept us. That's mercy, forgiveness, renewal. But there is also a mercy which is an everyday thing where we come to know that apart from our sinfulness, and in the midst of it, God is at work in our lives. That's what that's what Father Solanus means by blessed be God in all his designs. God has a plan for all of us. With all of our messed upness and all of the dark, confusing situations that we go through, God is at work. God is always there. And when we come to experience that, we know that not just up here, but down here. And then, like Solanus, we can say, oh my God, blessed be God in all his designs and in his mercy, which is above all his works. Well, as I said, this is the result of Solanus's life's journey. And this is the heart of everything that we're going to be talking about. And so I would like to share with you, and many of you know this, a little bit of how Solanus came to know this down here. It was through difficulties. You know that Solanus was the sixth of 16 children in a very faith-filled Irish family in Wisconsin. And when it came time for high school, Solanus thought that he would serve his family better by not going to high school and instead go out to make some money for this large family. And so he did. He had different jobs. He was a prison guard in Stillwater, Minnesota. He was a lumberjack, etc. And in the back of his mind, he frequently had the tug from God that he was to be a priest. Well, he didn't pay much attention to it until one time when he was a streetcar conductor in Superior. He rounded a corner and a woman was in the street being stabbed by a drunken sailor. And he got out and could do nothing anyway, but it was then that he really came to grips. There's got to be better ways to help people and make the world better than driving a streetcar. And so he went to his pastor and told him about his desire to be a priest. And by this time, he was about 25. And Superior, is right across from Duluth. It's at the top of Wisconsin. And the priest said, well, why don't you go to the seminary in Milwaukee, which is 400 miles from Superior? And that's what he did. Now, the very first year that he was there, things went fairly well. But let's realize he was 25. He was older than most of the young people in his class, and he had not really had high school. And besides that, Milwaukee was at that time the heart of German-speaking Catholic America. And so everything was in German, and the books were in Latin. And he didn't do well. And so after several years, the professors knew that he was a good person, but they thought, because he had such problem with languages, that he really didn't have too much up here. And so they said, well, maybe you're cut out for religious life, but not the priesthood. And they knew that in Milwaukee at that time, and still, there are Capuchins. And they said, why don't you go over and visit the Capuchins here in Milwaukee? And so he did, and he was not impressed. And part of the reason he was not impressed is that in those days, they too were German. So where is this helping? And also they wore beards, and he didn't like that. So he left the seminary and went back home in June of 1896. And confused, bewildered, and feeling like a failure. And he didn't know what to do or where to go. And at the end of November, 9 days before the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, December 8th, he made a novena to the Blessed Mother, asking her to help him find his direction. And on December 8th, he had an intense experience of the Blessed Mother, and he heard 3 words: go to Detroit. Well, he knew immediately what that meant, because he had visited the Capuchins in Milwaukee and learned from them in Milwaukee that Detroit is where they had their novitiate. So he was hearing the Lord say, that's where I want you. and it went against his grain. He had not been impressed with this group. It was going from one frying pan to another frying pan. I'm going to be putting up with all that German, etc. And so he set out immediately. It's what God wanted. In fact, his family, knowing that it would probably be his last opportunity for Christmas at home, it told him, well, why don't you wait till after Christmas? But no, he had been told, and he made that trip from Superior to Detroit and came to St. Bonaventure's on Christmas Eve of 1896. And being let in by the Cabochons, all the initial, I'm not so sure about this, came back. But then he went to bed, and we had, up until Vatican II, the custom that just before midnight on Christmas Eve, we would go through the corridors singing Christmas carols to wake all the other friars up, Christmas carols and incense. And something about that just put him totally at ease. He was where he was supposed to be. And this is where this saying came from. God had a design for him. All the time when he was feeling bewildered and confused and unsure, God was working out something. Blessed be God in all his designs and in his mercy, which is above all his works. That God would be doing that for me. And so that experience of mercy, and you see it is different, isn't it, than what Pope Francis is talking about? This is mercy that has less to do. Solanus knew and would often talk about what a sinner he was and in need of conversion he was. But what impressed Solanus about God's mercy is that it is this love and guidance that is always there in the midst of every human experience. I'm with you. You're not alone. I'm planning something. I'm doing something. And so that became the bedrock of his spirituality. God is here. You might feel, discombobulated. But God is here. And in his mercy, he's doing something, planning something. That's his bedrock, as I said, of his spirituality. And mercy is at the heart of it. But I think you can see, right, that this, and we'll get more into that, but looking at Solanus and how Solanus came to experience God's merciful presence is different than Pope Francis. And it helps us because we need to have both experiences. We are sinners, right? And we better admit it. And we need and have those embracing arms of God welcoming us, restoring us. But on an everyday level, we also are on a journey where we often do not know what's going on, right? Or why it's going on. Don't worry. God is here. God is here. You're not alone. That's mercy on an everyday level. And that's what Solanus says. Blessed be God in all his designs. And those designs are going on right now in your life and mine. Do you have eyes to see that? Do you have a heart to trust that? Blessed be God in all his designs and in his mercy, which is above all his works. And so, as I said, that is the foundation of Solanus' spirituality. And so when he continued to do his studies with the Capuchins in theology, he had the same experience that he had in Milwaukee at the diocesan seminary, and the superiors saying, well, you're a good person. You really are. But you haven't done too well in your studies. And you know that. And he did. So they said, how about this, Solanus? We will ordain you a priest, but you will never hear confessions. Because, you see, you really have to know your moral theology when you hear confessions. People come to you with serious concerns and problems, right? And so, but you didn't do well in moral theology. So, okay, we'll let you off the hook and the people off the hook in having to put up with you. So we'll ordain you, but you won't hear confessions. You know? And in addition to that, you know, when you preach, you better know your theology, or you're going to mess people up, leading them on a wrong, maybe even heretical direction, right? Well, you didn't do too well in your dogma. So we'll ordain you, but you'll never hear confessions, and you will never preach publicly. Blessed be God in all his designs and in his mercy, which is above all his works. I accept it. I will do it. I will be grateful for it and never question it, because I've come to know that God is at work here. And Solanus never did question that. And we've come to understand that Solanus, who came from an Irish family, had real problems with languages. He was not dumb intellectually, but he had a problem with languages. And so he didn't grasp a lot of stuff that other people who knew those languages could. And so when we read his writings and his whole life, we can understand what those Capuchin superiors did and why they did it, but we can also see that in many ways they were wrong, because he did have a grasp of what was essential, and he knew how to be with people to help them to grasp what was essential. But it made no difference that he was not looked upon as someone as intelligent as other Cabotians. He accepted his limitations, but God was at work in his mercy. Blessed be God in all his designs that are constantly at work, and in his mercy, which is above all his works. That's the heart of theology. That's the heart of spirituality. That's the heart of the gospel. And they're not just words. They're a life. A life. One of the 50 years after Solanus entered the Cabetian order in Detroit, this would have been on January 14th, 1947, there was a remembrance card that was made for the Jubilee, and Solanus asked that the very first words on that card of remembrance would be these words: "Thanks be to God for uncountable mercies for all things." And several years later, just prior to the 48th anniversary of his ordination, he wrote to our brother Leo, whom many of you knew and died a few years ago. He wrote to our brother Leo, who was working with Cabotian novices. These are his words, Solanus's. "Please have them supply, through prayer, my lack of appreciation and gratitude to God for the uncounted mercies and graces I have received these 48 years. Without our half realizing it, we are continually immersed in God's merciful graces like the air that permeates us." Glory be to God. I love that image, and that really is one of the few places in his writings where I have detected a kind of poetry. He doesn't usually talk in these similes and metaphors, but we are wrapped in God's mercy like the air that surrounds us. It's there all the time. But you don't pay attention to the air. You take it for granted. And you don't pay attention to the mercy without our half realizing it. We are continually immersed in God's merciful graces like the air that permeates us. Could we wake up and see what we are wrapped in every day and every minute of the day? It's God's merciful graces. At the beginning of this talk, I meant to say that I'd like to share two results that happened for Solanus as a result of being wrapped in God's mercy all the time. And he was aware of it. That's the difference. He was aware of it. The first result for Solanus, and it's natural, blessed be God in all his designs and in his mercy, which is above all his works. And so, without ever saying anything like what I'm going to say, Solanus was saying, I am exhibit A of what God does in his mercy. And then, so too is everybody else. And when people would come to the monastery door, this was basically what Solanus would be telling them. In the midst of their pain, in the midst of their darkness, he understood that. He had been there, done that. And God was there in the midst of all of that. And so, without ever trying to downgrade or minimize people's pain and suffering, he would try to help them to see God's designs. There's more going on here. And can you be in touch with that? You're not just going through junk. God is here, right here, in the midst of the darkness, the pain, the grief. God's right here. Blessed be God in all his designs and in his mercy, which is above all his works. And so, that was everything to Solanus, and everything that was behind everything that he did for other people, opening their hearts to the same experience that he had in the midst of their pain. So the first result for Solanus of being wrapped and being aware that he was wrapped in God's mercy, the first result is praise. Praise. And people who knew him, and I would hear this, he had a very high-pitched voice because he had, when he was a teenager, he had some kind of a throat ailment that left him high-pitched. And God is so good. God is so good that it would almost bring tears. And that's in the midst of junk. God is so good. Praise is the first result of Solanus for living in the awareness of God's mercy. And I have thought in my own life, and I think in most of our lives, we're not very good at praise. We don't do very much of it. Oh, I can be grateful if everything works out the way I want it to work out. But when I'm in the midst of junk and pain and darkness, what comes out of my life? My mouth. It very seldom is praise. But it would for Solanus, because he knew in the midst of those experiences, he was wrapped in God's mercy like the air. And God was doing something. I don't know what it is, but God is doing something. God is so good. When he was laid up, for example, in 1942, for weeks in the hospital, he wrote to his brother Lawrence and said, "Praise be Jesus. I'm still here on only one foot, but I hope to be released soon. 6 weeks it will be tomorrow, the longest I have ever been laid up. Thank God, however, I see his merciful and gentle hand in it all. Praise for this God who is hidden but at work. In July of 1957, the month that he died, he was covered, as you might know, with painful, bloody, itchy eczema all over his body. And one of the sisters who nursed him recalled that her words. In the midst of all of that, he frequently spoke of God's mercy with such childlike tenderness that tears would come to his eyes. God is so good, he would say. And then he would repeat slowly and quietly, glory be to God, glory be to God. Blessed be God in all his designs, right now, right here, and in his mercy, which is above all his works. Praise is the first result of living in mercy. The second result for Solanus was a life of peaceful trust and confidence. If God is at work in the midst of the junk, the darkness, what do you have to worry about? Solanus exuded an atmosphere of peace and trust and confidence, and things were not la-ti-da for him, ever. But God is so good, and we're wrapped in his mercy. And so what are you afraid of? You will have what you need. Psalm 131 is beautiful and reflects Solanus' spirit. Psalm 131 says, Lord, I am not proud, holding my head too high, reaching beyond my grasp. No, I am calm and tranquil, like a weaned child resting in its mother's arms, my whole being at rest. Let Israel rest in the Lord now and forever. Solanus himself, a couple of years before he died, seemed to be thinking of that psalm when he said, if we prepare for the moment of our passing from time to eternity, it can be like that of a tired child, confident in the arms that are enfolding it. What are you worried about? So many people would write to Solanus about their fears and their worries. This is the answer that he gave to one of them. Why should we worry? Why not rather ponder on the wonderful, innumerable manifestations whereby God, in his wisdom and power and mercy, has brought us into existence and thus far preserved us, notwithstanding our waywardness, our stupidity, and our sinfulness? Is not his desire for our happiness, even temporal as well as eternal, more manifest at every turn than that of the most loving parents and friends? Why are you worried? He wrote to a sister, a religious sister, who was overly preoccupied about herself and her sinfulness, and would God ever forgive? And he had a hard time with that, because it's forgetting all of this. And he said, to worry about the past or the future is really to no purpose because of this. It's quite a different thing to regret our blunders, and God knows we've all made plenty of them, and humbly deplore them. But worry and fret? No. That's what hell wants us to do. Rather, draw good out of them by praising God for his mercy. And here he says something very humorous to this nun to probably kind of jolt her into awareness. Draw good out of them by praising God for his mercy to us and his infinite patience in not kicking to blazes us good-for-nothings. You have no idea how much I need prayers, conversion, as well as you. So the second result of being wrapped in God's mercy and being aware of that is trust, confidence. I'm not afraid. I'm at peace. The first result is praise. He told his own brother, Maurice, who battled depression, when we think of past blessings and merciful providence, notwithstanding our own sinfulness, whereby God has blessed us, why should we not foster confidence by thanking him for the future ahead of time? Blessed be God in all his designs and in his mercy, which is above all his works. Let's take some time in quiet now to allow those words to not just be words, to look into your own experience. Where have you experienced what Solanus experienced? That in the midst of your confusion, not knowing, your darknesses, your junk, God was doing something. God was doing something. You've experienced it. That's God's mercy. Well, if that's your experience, then let us be more like Solanus and trust that mercy right now when we continue to have another form of darkness, right? We are wrapped in God's mercy like the air we breathe. Let's all conclude by saying together, blessed be God in all his designs and in his mercy, which is above all his works. So thank you. And we'll get together, let's say 10 after 11, okay? So let's try to have quiet time right now. Let's try not to talk so that we can absorb what God is trying to say to each of us. You can go to the chapel or wherever, okay?